All right, so today we're diving into something pretty heavy. The Texas Tower Sniper, August 1st, 1966. It's a scorching summer day in Austin. Picture the University of Texas campus. Students are going about their day, totally unsuspecting. And then everything changes with Charles Whitman and the violence he unleashes from the UT Tower. You've sent over a ton of research on this, so let's just get right into it. What can you tell us about how meticulously planned this attack was and why it was so shocking?
Well, it's almost like Whitman was putting together a toolkit for this attack. We're talking 3 rifles, 2 pistols, and even a sawed-off shotgun. Not exactly your typical hunting gear. And get this, he even modified the shotgun. He chopped it down to make it easier to use in that tight space up on that observation deck.
Seriously. And it wasn't just about the firepower. He had food packed. Water, vitamins. It's almost like he was prepping for a siege, which is a pretty chilling thought.
So he wasn't messing around at all. This was definitely premeditated. But why go through the trouble of modifying the shotgun? Was that a common thing for snipers back then? Not really. Most snipers really value accuracy and range, and a sawed-off shotgun kind of sacrifices both of those. So this modification tells us there's something else going on here, you see. Shortening the barrel makes the spread of the shot much wider, which means you don't have to be as precise with your aim. It's really about maximizing that damage at close range, turning it into a truly brutal weapon for close quarters violence.
That is a terrifying image.
Yeah.
So this wasn't just about picking off targets from a distance. He was ready for close encounters. For a level of brutality, that's just hard to wrap your head around. And it makes you wonder about his state of mind going into all of this.
Yeah.
Where does this fit in with the history of mass shootings in America? Was this one of the first?
Well, it wasn't the very first, but the Texas Tower shooting was definitely a major turning point. It was one of the first to be broadcast live on the radio, and that really amplified the terror and turned it into a nationwide spectacle.
I can't even imagine what it must have been like for people listening to that broadcast. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's go back to the beginning of the attack. He didn't just start shooting from the tower, right?
No. The violence actually started much earlier, the night before the tower attack. Whitman killed his mother and his wife in their homes. He left notes, almost matter-of-factly detailing his actions.
He killed his own mother and wife before going to the tower. That's just another level of disturbing.
It is. It points to a level of premeditation and detachment that's just baffling, like he was methodically checking off steps in some horrible plan.
So he kills his mother and wife, and then what? He just goes straight to the tower?
Well, the next morning, Whitman went to a gun shop, bought even more ammunition, and told him he was going on a hunting trip. Just imagine that chilling contrast. This seemingly normal guy buying supplies for a massacre.
Talk about a wolf in sheep's clothing. And then he just strolls onto campus.
Yeah, around noon, Whitman arrives at the tower. He's disguised himself as a maintenance worker. He even fools a kind employee into reactivating a broken elevator, so he can haul all his equipment up to the observation deck.
Wow. He was really using deception to get to his objective, exploiting people's kindness for such a horrific purpose.
Yeah.
Okay, so he's on the observation deck now, armed to the teeth. What happens next?
So on the 28th floor, he encounters the receptionist, Edna Townsley. He brutally attacks her and leaves her for dead. Then he barricades himself on the observation deck, and when a family approaches, mistaking him for someone harmless, he opens fire, instantly killing 2 of them and wounding others. That's when the real chaos begins.
So the first victims on campus were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's just senseless.
Exactly. And from that point on, it was just this horrifying cascade of violence. Whitman had strategically positioned himself. He had turned the observation deck into a sniper's nest. He had this clear view of the campus below, and he just used it to deadly effect, firing indiscriminately at people.
So he was really using his military training to turn the tower into a platform for terror. And all those people below, they had no idea what was happening. They had no chance.
And the police were totally outmatched at first. Armed with just pistols, they were at a severe disadvantage against Whitman's high-powered rifles. Just imagine that desperation, that feeling of helplessness as they tried to contain the situation.
It must have been pure chaos. People scattering, running for their lives, not knowing where the shots were even coming from.
Absolutely. And to make matters worse, the whole thing was unfolding live on the radio. A reporter named Neil Speltz was broadcasting from the scene. His voice was relaying the horror to a nationwide audience.
So people all across the country were listening to this unfold in real time. That must have added another layer of terror to it, knowing that innocent people were being targeted and feeling completely helpless to do anything about it.
It was a terrifying moment in American history. It broadcast the vulnerability of everyday life. and the sheer randomness of violence. And it really shows the power and the danger of the media back then. But even amidst this chaos, there were some incredible acts of courage, too. Civilians like Alan Crum risked their lives to drag wounded people to safety. They were literally putting themselves in the line of fire to help others.
It's like that Mr. Rogers quote, look for the helpers.
Yeah.
Even in the face of such horrific violence, there are always those who step up. It gives you a little bit of hope for humanity.
Absolutely. And those acts of courage were vital in saving lives that day. But let's get back to the tower. We've talked about the meticulous planning, the horrifying efficiency of Whitman's attack. But what drove him to this? What led him to that point?
Yeah, we got to try and understand the why behind this. We have all this information about his background. Where do we even begin to unpack all of that?
Well, let's start with his childhood. Lake Worth, Florida. On the surface, it seemed idyllic. Comfortable home, loving mother. But behind that facade, there was a much darker reality.
So like the classic picture-perfect life, hiding some real turmoil underneath. What was going on?
His father, Charles Sr., was a successful businessman, a real pillar of the community. But he was also incredibly controlling and abusive. He ruled the household with an iron fist, resorted to physical violence to discipline his sons, including Charles.
You're more than just strict parenting.
Oh, absolutely. This was systematic physical abuse, beatings with belts and paddles, incidents so severe that neighbors frequently called the police. Now imagine growing up in that environment, the constant fear, the unpredictable outbursts of rage. It's a breeding ground for trauma.
It's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
I can't help but think about that photo of young Charles Whitman, posing with those oversized hunting rifles, almost dwarfed by their size. It takes on a whole new meaning knowing about this abusive environment.
Yeah, it's like foreshadowing, right? A young boy surrounded by symbols of violence, almost learning that aggression is the way to assert control.
But even with this really messed up childhood, Whitman was a high achiever. Eagle Scout. Good grades. It's almost like he was trying to overcompensate for something, prove something.
There's this real push and pull between potential and darkness with this guy. He joins the Marines, seeking escape from his father, but he finds himself drawn to the discipline and structure of military life. He excels as a sharpshooter, earning praise for his marksmanship. It's like he found this channel for his aggression that was both rewarding and dangerous.
But even then, there are these red flags popping up. He's disciplined for gambling, loan sharking, possessing an illegal firearm. It's like the darkness was always there, simmering beneath the surface.
Exactly. And when the Marines withdraw his scholarship due to academic problems, it's a crushing blow for him. This guy who would always strive for success suddenly feels like a failure, crumbling under the weight of all those expectations.
And it seems like that feeling of inadequacy, of not measuring up, it really haunted him. Especially when he's back in Austin, struggling to cope with civilian life. He's experiencing these intense headaches, fits of rage. He's documenting these violent thoughts in his journal. It's like he's losing control, becoming the very thing he feared his father.
It's tragic, isn't it? Trying to escape that cycle of abuse, only to find himself repeating it. But there is this moment where it seems like he's trying to break free. He goes to see a campus psychiatrist, confesses all these disturbing thoughts he's having, even mentions a fantasy of shooting people from the tower.
So he knew something was wrong. He was reaching out, trying to get help.
He was, but the psychiatrist, maybe not fully grasping the severity of his condition, didn't take immediate action. It's a really haunting detail, like a missed opportunity to intervene, to potentially prevent the whole tragedy.
If Whitman didn't go back for a follow-up appointment, though, right? Even though the psychiatrist recommended it, it's like he was resigned to his fate. Like he'd already made a decision.
It really makes you wonder, to what extent was Whitman even in control of his actions? Was he a victim of his past, of his mental state? Or was there a deliberate choice to embrace that violence? It's a question that people still debate today.
It's a tough one for sure. But we can't ignore the autopsy findings, can we? The discovery of that brain tumor, pressing on his amygdala, that part of the brain that regulates emotions.
That's right. The amygdala plays a huge role in processing fear, anger, aggression. And the fact that this tumor was putting pressure on it raises a huge question. Did it influence Whitman's actions? Could it have been a contributing factor, impairing his judgment, fueling his rage?
So not necessarily a direct cause, but possibly a contributing factor. Just adds another layer of a complexity to this already complicated case. So we've got this brutal act, a really troubled past, and a possible biological factor. How do we even start to make sense of all of this?
Well, despite the tumor, Whitman's motive still remains a mystery. His notes. While they detail his struggles, they don't offer a clear explanation for why he chose to target those innocent people.
It's that lack of a clear motive that's really unsettling. It makes it so much harder to find any reason in this.
Exactly. And then there's another intriguing detail. Whitman requested cremation in his notes, but in the end, he was buried next to his mother. He was denied his own final wish. What do you make of that?
I don't know. Was it his family's decision? Some attempt at reconciliation? It's just another piece of this puzzle. It doesn't quite fit.
It definitely adds to the enigma of Charles Whitman, the man who remains a mystery even in death. But it also raises important questions about how we as a society respond to these acts of violence. How do we make sense of the senseless?
I feel like we've been peeling back layers of this onion. It just gets more and more complex. We've talked about the sheer brutality, Whitman's past, the brain tumor, and that lack of a clear motive. So where do we go from here? What can we even take away from all of this?
I think one of the things that stands out is the need to understand mental health better. You know, Whitman was obviously struggling. He did reach out for help, but for some reason it wasn't enough. What if the system had been different back then? If there had been more awareness, maybe things could have gone a different way.
It makes you think about all the what ifs. Like, what if he had gotten the support he needed? Could this whole thing have been prevented? It's tough not to feel some frustration with that.
It is, and I think it really highlights how important early intervention is. We need to break down that stigma around mental health, make resources more accessible. We need to create a culture where people feel comfortable seeking help, without judgment.
For sure. And speaking of uncomfortable conversations, we have to talk about domestic violence and the role it played in Whitman's life. That kind of abuse can have such a lasting impact, shaping a person's whole worldview.
It's like that saying, violence begets violence. Whitman's father was so abusive. And while that doesn't excuse Charles's actions, it does offer some insight into where he might have learned those behaviors.
It's like a cycle, one that needs to be broken. We have to support victims of domestic violence, hold abusers accountable, and create a culture of respect and nonviolence.
Couldn't agree more. And then you have the issue of firearms. Whitman having access to all those weapons, it allowed him to inflict so much damage. It brings up some really tough questions. Gun control, responsible ownership, background checks. Those are all conversations we need to have as a society.
It's about finding that balance between individual rights and public safety. It's not easy, but it's crucial.
Right. And it's important to remember that the Texas Tower shooting was one of the first to be broadcast live, that it brought that horror right into people's living rooms. It changed the way we consume and think about these events.
It's true. The media has such a huge influence on how we perceive violence, it feels like sometimes. There's this fascination with these tragedies, a focus on the perpetrators that overshadows the victims and the impact it has on entire communities.
And that's where responsible storytelling becomes so important. We need to focus on the human cost of these events, the ripple effects, the search for solutions, not sensationalizing the violence.
We need to use those platforms to educate, to promote empathy, to start conversations, not fear or division.
Absolutely. Ultimately, the Texas Tower shooting is this stark reminder of the potential for violence that's out there. It's a call to action to address those underlying issues, to talk about mental health, to create safe and supportive communities, to have those difficult but necessary conversations about gun control and responsibility.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think the biggest question is, where do we go from here? How do we learn from the past and stop these kinds of tragedies from happening again? It's a heavy topic, but a vital one.